Chapter 1. The Last Candle. In the quiet heart of winter, with the fields lying bare beneath a skim of brittle frost, and the lanes of Alderley treacherous with frozen ruts, there were few events to quicken the villagers' pulses. Christmas was long past. Easter, with its hopeful daffodils, still a distant dream, but Candlemas Eve, now that was different. Each year the village stirred from its winter slumber to mark the occasion. Children would be scrubbed pink and shiny. Housewives would polish candlesticks to gleaming perfection. The vicar would prepare a sermon stitched together from hopeful psalms and ancient tradition. And St. Mildred's Church, usually a rather plain edifice of lichen-stained stone, would glow for a few hours with a kind of fragile, solemn beauty. Miss Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead at the invitation of her dear friend Mrs. Templeton, was delighted to find herself in the midst of it. A woman who understood the delicate undercurrents of village life better than most, she knew at once that such an event would reveal more about Alderley's true character than a dozen afternoon teas. And so, on the morning of February 1st, she found herself bundled against the chill, helping Mrs. Templeton and several other ladies of the parish in the decoration of St. Mildred's. They moved through the dim nave, their breath misting in the air, securing sprigs of holly and ivy to the pews. Mrs. Partridge, a woman with opinions on everything from altar cloths to other people's marriages, bustled about issuing instructions, while young Peter Denholm, pressed into service by his mother, polished the brass candlesticks with a boy's typical mixture of reluctance and pride. "Such a lovely tradition," murmured Miss Marple, tying a ribbon of white silk around the final pew end. The blessing of the candles, light against darkness, renewal in the heart of winter. "Yes, well," said Mrs. Partridge with a sniff, "let's hope the wind doesn't blow all the candles out again like it did in '39. That was a sorry spectacle." Miss Marple only smiled, her fingers deftly adjusting a slipping sprig of ivy. She had lived long enough to know that behind every complaint lay some fond memory reluctant to admit itself. Outside, the pale sun sank lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the churchyard where ancient gravestones jutted from the earth like crooked teeth. Somewhere a rook cawed mournfully. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the kind of evening where secrets might stir. The service began at 4:30, timed so that the congregation could exit the church into full darkness, each carrying a single lit candle to bless their homes. Inside St. Mildred's the scene was almost otherworldly. The candles were gathered before the altar, each thin white taper bearing the hopeful names of the households they represented. The great stone walls, cold and damp in daylight, seemed now to embrace the light, trapping it in pools of gold along the flagstones. The villagers arrived in a steady trickle, stamping the frost from their boots, exchanging murmured greetings. Emily Carew, a quiet woman of some 50-odd years, known for her genteel ways and immaculate lace collars, slipped in with little fanfare, taking her usual place 3 rows from the front. She nodded politely to Mrs. Partridge, smiled faintly at the vicar, and folded her gloved hands primly atop her hymn book. Miss Marple noted the small details, the tension about Emily's mouth, the quick downward flicker of her gaze when Peter Denholm passed her pew. Nothing overt, but enough to prick her curiosity. The service proceeded with the usual solemnity. Reverend Templeton, a good man, if occasionally rather woolly-minded, delivered a sermon about the hope of light overcoming darkness. The congregation dutifully sang, "The Lord is my light, and Jesus, light of the world." Children fidgeted. Old Mr. Whitby wheezed asthmatically through the prayers. At last the candles were lit, one by one, a spreading sea of flickering stars in the darkened nave. There was a moment, just one, where time seemed to still. Dozens of small flames wavered. Dozens of faces, upturned and solemn, were caught in their fragile glow, and then the vicar gave the dismissal, and the congregation turned slowly and reverently to leave. One by one they stepped out into the cold. carrying their little lights into the waiting night. It was only after the last hymn had faded and the last parishioner had filed out that Mrs. Webb noticed. "Where's Emily?" she said sharply, scanning the darkened pews. The vicar, startled, blinked owlishly through his spectacles. "She was here, wasn't she?" asked Mrs. Partridge, frowning. "Of course she was," Mrs. Webb insisted. "I saw her light her candle just before the procession." The ladies peered into the dim recesses of the church, but there was no sign of Emily. Carew. Someone suggested she had gone ahead to the church hall, where the supper waited, trestle tables groaning under sausage rolls and sandwiches and weak tea. But when the stragglers gathered there, bustling to and fro in the steamy warmth, there was no Emily. And that was when the murmurs started. By 6 o'clock, the murmurs had become alarm. Constable Pritchard, a stout, red-faced man who had been halfway through a plate of jam tarts, was summoned. A search of the church was undertaken. The vestry, the choir loft, even the small, seldom-used crypt beneath the nave. They found nothing but damp stone and scurrying spiders. The search widened to the graveyard. Footprints were muddled by the tramping of the congregation, but there was no obvious trail leading away. Mrs. Templeton, pale and anxious, kept wringing her hands. Perhaps she took ill, she ventured desperately, wandered off for help. But no neighbor reported seeing a lone figure on the lanes. No passing car had noticed anyone walking the road into the village, and the lights in Emily Carew's small cottage, a neat, ivy-smothered affair down Mill Lane, remained dark and uninviting as the evening dragged into night and lanterns bobbed through the churchyard like uneasy will-o'-the-wisps. A fearful certainty settled over Alderley. Emily Carew had disappeared, and not naturally. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner of the church hall, said little, but her mind was working furiously. In her experience, when a disappearance occurred so publicly, so suddenly, it was rarely without purpose. She thought of Emily's tense mouth, of the odd glances exchanged between Peter Denholm and Mr. Webb, of Mrs. Blake's anxious whisper to the vicar before the service. She thought, too, of something else, the peculiar hesitation she had glimpsed as Emily Carew had taken her candle from the altar, as if she had been afraid to touch it. Miss Marple rose, brushing a few crumbs from her lap. Outside, the night was thick and cold, swallowing the fields and cottages into darkness. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the last candle's glow, answers waited, and Miss Marple, quiet, unassuming, infinitely persistent, intended to find them. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark by Morning. Alderley was humming with speculation. The mist had thickened overnight, cloaking the village in a damp, eerie stillness. The usual sounds of daily life, the clatter of milk churns, the clucking of hens, the chatter of neighbors at the baker's, were muted, subdued by an air of unease. Mrs. Partridge was the first to make her way to the green, where a few determined villagers gathered, huddled against the mist, and talking in hushed, urgent tones. "Mark my words," she declared, stabbing her umbrella into the gravel for emphasis. "The girl's gone off to London, taken up with some unsuitable man, no doubt. That's what comes of being unmarried at her age." Mrs. Webb sniffed loudly. "Emily Carew, don't be ridiculous. She wouldn't so much as set foot outside after dark without a proper escort. No, I say, she's been spirited away." "Spirited away?" echoed old Mr. Waring, lifting an eyebrow. Mrs. Webb leaned in, lowering her voice to a thrilling whisper. "The churchyard, Mr. Waring. You know how it is. All those old graves, ghosts and such. My mother always said Candlemas was a thin time when the veil was lifted." "Hogwash," interrupted Mrs. Partridge briskly. "Ghosts don't carry off middle-aged schoolmistresses. Flesh and blood, that's what this is." Despite the scoffing tone, even Mrs. Partridge's ruddy face was pinched with worry. Miss Marple, who happened to be crossing the green at that moment, paused just within earshot. She did not interrupt. She merely adjusted her gloves and listened, her pale blue eyes calm and thoughtful. It was always revealing, she found, how people reacted to tragedy. Some rushed to superstition, others clung to scandal. Few, very few, looked for the simple human heart of things. Already the divisions in Alderley were showing. Already the truth, whatever it was, had begun to hide itself among the words. At the vicarage, a rather different meeting was taking place. Reverend Templeton, gray with worry and clutching his teacup like a lifeline, sat across from Constable Pritchard and Inspector Graves, who had been summoned from the nearby town of Melford. Graves was a neat man, precise in speech and movement. He had questioned the villagers who had last seen Emily Carew, Reverend Templeton, Mrs. Webb, Peter Denholm, and taken careful notes. But the facts remained stubbornly few. Emily Carew had been present at the Candlemas service. She had taken her candle with the others. She had walked, presumably, out of the church and into the night, and then nothing, no witnesses, no trail, no explanation. Graves drummed his fingers lightly on the table. Most likely, he said, Miss Carew suffered some sort of attack, a fit of confusion, wandered into the fields perhaps. Frostbite or exposure could do the rest in a night like last. But we searched, said Constable Pritchard, a little desperately. The fields, the hedgerows, even the riverbank. Graves shrugged. Miss Carew is not a large woman. If she fell into a ditch or lay hidden among brambles, we might easily have missed her. Miss Marple, who had been quietly sipping her tea by the hearth, spoke for the first time. And yet, she said gently, Miss Carew was not the sort to become confused. She had her habits, very precise ones. She never even crossed the green without gloves or left her cottage without first fastening every button. Graves turned to Fadzik eyes, her polite but faintly patronizing. Human nature can surprise us, madam, he said. Miss Marple smiled serenely. Indeed it can, she agreed, in ways both predictable and unforeseen. Graves, misunderstanding entirely, took this as a concession and returned to his paperwork. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly in her lap and thought, if Emily Carew had not vanished through accident or madness, then someone had helped her to disappear, willingly or otherwise. And if so, who? The morning passed in restless, fruitless activity. Men in heavy boots trudged across the frozen fields, poking into ditches with sticks. Women formed small knots near their cottage doors, their conversation swinging between fearful speculation and barely veiled accusation. By noon, half a dozen explanations had taken root. Miss Carew had run away with a secret lover. Miss Carew had fallen into the river. Miss Carew had been abducted by vagrants. None of them satisfied Miss Marple, because there was something else, something small, something overlooked. She could not forget the moment in the church, the peculiar hesitation when Emily Carew had taken her candle. Nor could she forget the way Mrs. Blake had drawn the vicar aside just before the service, her face drawn and troubled. These things, small though they were, did not fit neatly into tales of accident or romance. There was a pattern, she was sure. It was simply a matter of seeing it. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate walk through the village. She nodded to Mrs. Scatting, who was pruning her rose bushes with unnecessary violence. She paused to admire Mrs. Blake's washing. White sheets hung limp and lifeless in the mist. She exchanged a few polite words with Peter Denholm, who stood in his mother's shop stacking tins of sardines with a distracted air. Everywhere she went, she listened, not to the words necessarily, but to the silences, the nervousness, the too hasty denials. It was remarkable, she thought, how the guilty and the merely frightened betrayed themselves by the things they did not say. By the way, Peter Denholm's hand trembled just slightly as he reached for a tin. By the way, Mrs. Blake's eyes skittered away when the name Carew was mentioned. By the way, Mr. Webb, ordinarily full of bluster and hearty pronouncements, now seemed almost sheepish. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage just as the mist thickened again, curling along the lanes like pale smoke. She settled herself by the fire, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. She was very patient and very sure. Somewhere in Alderley, the truth waited, crouched, shivering, beneath a quilt of half-truths and fear. It only needed the right moment to coax it into the light, and Miss Marple, as always, would know exactly when that moment had come. Chapter 3. A Search and a Discovery. The second morning after Emily Carew's disappearance dawned clearer, but no less cold. Frost rimed every bare twig and blade of grass, turning Alderley into a kingdom of fragile silver. By 9 o'clock, a new, more organized search had been set in motion. Inspector Graves, with a mixture of doggedness and irritation, had summoned volunteers, stout men with lanterns and long poles, to comb the fields more thoroughly, widening the perimeter beyond the immediate village. Systematic search, that's the thing, Graves declared, consulting a rough map of the area drawn on the back of a sermon leaflet. Every field, every ditch, every hedgerow. Constable Pritchard, looking somewhat pink and uncomfortable in the chill air, was tasked with coordinating the local farmers. Miss Marple watched the preparations from a bench by the churchyard wall, a neat figure in her dove-gray coat and felt hat. Her knitting was, as always, in her lap, but the needles lay idle. Her mind, as sharp and industrious as ever, was knitting together far more intangible threads. She was not convinced that systematic searches would yield Miss Carew. If Emily had simply fallen, lost her way, suffered a faint, succumbed to the cold, surely some trace would have been found by now. A scrap of cloth, a broken branch, the outline of a fall in the frost. But there was nothing, and absence, Miss Marple knew, was as telling as presence. Still, it would not do to dismiss possibilities out of hand, and so she rose stiffly and made her way toward the edge of the green, where the first search parties were setting off. The fields beyond Alderley spread wide and low, sloping gently toward the river valley. In summer they were a patchwork of crops. Now they lay bare, interrupted only by sparse hedgerows and the occasional scatter of leafless trees. It was Peter Denholm, young and eager to prove himself useful, who first called out. "Here! Something's here!" The men converged swiftly, Inspector Graves at their head. Miss Marple, too, drew near, her steps careful on the frost-hardened earth. At the base of a thorny hedge, partly concealed by the low-hanging branches, lay a battered leather handbag, its strap twisted, its clasp sprung open. It was a woman's bag, and not just any woman's. Inside, tucked among a lace-edged handkerchief, a small hymn book and a packet of peppermint lozenges, was a letter addressed to Miss Emily Carew. Mrs. Templeton, arriving breathlessly at Miss Marple's side, gave a little gasp. "It's hers," she whispered. Inspector Graves bent to examine the contents with a gloved hand. His face was grim. "No money," he said shortly. "Not so much as a shilling." The villagers, who had gathered in a loose, murmuring circle, shifted uneasily. Miss Marple said nothing. She watched the scene intently, her sharp eyes taking in not only the bag but the expressions on the faces around her. Peter Denholm, flushed, excited. Mrs. Partridge, frowning fiercely, arms folded. Mr. Webb, unusually quiet, his eyes darting away whenever they neared the handbag. Most curious of all was Mrs. Blake, who stood apart, clutching her shawl about her shoulders, her face pale and closed. Graves straightened, the bag dangling from his fingers. "Well, we've proof now," he said. "Miss Carew was taken, mugged likely." Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was mild but firm. "Is it not odd," she said gently, "that the bag should be found here, some distance from the church, and along no path Miss Carew would naturally have taken home?" Graves gave a short laugh. "Lost her way, perhaps. Confused." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, smiling sweetly, but her mind was racing. Emily Carew was a woman of rigid habits. She had walked from St. Mildred's to her cottage every Sunday for years without once varying her route. Why, then, would she have ventured into the fields, especially on a freezing, misty night? No. The bag had been placed here. Placed deliberately, a trail, Miss Marple thought grimly, for others to follow and be misled. The discovery of the handbag sent fresh ripples of gossip through Alderley. By noon the village was buzzing anew. "Robbery," declared Mrs. Partridge with grim satisfaction, as if she had predicted it all along. Probably a tramp, one of those ruffians from the railway line. Or perhaps, suggested Mrs. Webb with relish, someone closer to home. You know what they say, you never really know your neighbors. The talk was fueled by half-truths and embroidered memories. Hadn't Peter Denholm been short on funds lately? Hadn't Mrs. Blake been seen arguing with Miss Carew about the church accounts? Hadn't Mr. Webb once been rejected, rather cruelly some said, by Miss Carew when he had proposed marriage years ago? Everyone, it seemed, had something to say. Everyone, it seemed, had some small reason to wish Emily Carew ill. Miss Marple listened to it all, her knitting moving steadily in her lap. Patterns, she thought. People always wove patterns, but the truth often lay in the thread that didn't fit. Later that day, Inspector Graves held a brief meeting in the vestry of St. Mildred's, inviting those closest to Miss Carew to speak voluntarily. Miss Marple, naturally, attended. Peter Denholm stammered through his statement. He had been polishing the candlesticks after the service, he said, and hadn't seen Miss Carew leave. Mrs. Blake spoke briefly and coldly, offering little beyond what was already known. Mr. Webb was jovial, almost. Aggressively so, declaring that Emily had been the steadiest woman in Alderley, never caused a fuss, never wandered off. The vicar, poor man, simply wrung his hands and said he had seen nothing unusual. Miss Marple watched it all with detached interest. The details mattered, of course. But so did the tone, the flicker of fear in Peter's eyes, the tightness in Mrs. Blake's mouth, the false heartiness in Mr. Webb's voice. They were all hiding something, not necessarily guilt, but secrets, certainly. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, were like cracks in a frozen pond, dangerous, widening under pressure, waiting for the right moment to shatter. She rose as the meeting concluded, smiling sweetly at Inspector Graves's perfunctory thanks. Outside, the first thin flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the gray earth with a deceptive softness. Miss Marple lifted her face to the sky. Snow would cover tracks, she thought, but it could not cover guilt. Not forever. Chapter 4. Shadows and Secrets. The snow fell steadily that night, softening the harsh edges of Alderley beneath a thin, deceptive blanket. In the lamplight, the cottages looked almost cheerful, warm golden squares of light against the white gloom. But inside, nerves were fraying. By morning, the world was transformed. The lanes and fields were unbroken expanses of white, disturbed only by the occasional lone footprint or the sluggish track of a cart. The village, muffled and silent under its wintry covering, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, seated by Mrs. Templeton's fireside, watched the flames dance with mild eyes, but her mind was anything but tranquil. Emily Carew's handbag, found so conveniently and so publicly, had shifted the atmosphere in the village. Suspicion, always a hardy weed in small communities, was now growing rampant. But suspicion, Miss Marple reflected, was not proof, and misdirection, in her considerable experience, was as natural to some people as breathing. There were still too many loose threads. She meant gently but firmly to tug them. Mid-morning found her taking a slow and deliberate stroll through the village, ostensibly to admire the snow. Mrs. Templeton had tried to dissuade her. "The roads are treacherous, Jane dear, and you're not as young as you were." But Miss Marple only smiled and wrapped her scarf tighter. Experience, she thought, had taught her when people said stay indoors, they often meant don't come looking. She made her way first. To Mrs. Blake's cottage, a neat little place with a bird feeder dangling forlornly from a crooked apple tree. Mrs. Blake answered the door quickly, as if she had been hovering nearby. Her expression was guarded. "Good morning, my dear," said Miss Marple, bright as a winter robin. "I thought I might ask how you were bearing up. All this worry about poor Miss Carew, one hardly knows what to think." Mrs. Blake hesitated, then ushered her in. The front parlor was overheated and smelled strongly of lavender polish. A small fire burned low in the grate. "I don't know what to think either," said Mrs. Blake, fussing with the tea things. "It's ghastly, of course, but—" She trailed off. "But?" Miss Marple encouraged gently. Mrs. Blake shook her head, frowning into her teacup. "I shouldn't say. It's wicked to think ill of people without proof." "Indeed it is," agreed Miss Marple serenely. "Though sometimes, of course, the little things people overlook can be most telling." Mrs. Blake bit her lip. She was a woman used to keeping confidences, but also to savoring them. At last she said, "It's Peter Denholm. He owed Miss Carew money. I heard her scolding him about it in the church vestry, not a fortnight ago. He's a good boy, really, but impetuous." "Ah," said Miss Marple, knitting a few invisible stitches, "youth can be reckless. Still, money troubles are such a common thing. One hardly murders over a few pounds." Mrs. Blake flushed. "Of course not. But when people are desperate—" Miss Marple let the words trail away naturally. It was, after all, often better to leave a door ajar and wait for people to walk through it themselves. From Mrs. Blake's she proceeded by seemingly casual turns to Webb's farm. Mr. Webb was in his barn, tending to a sulky horse. He was a large man, red-faced and heavy-handed, but careful to put on an air of joviality when Miss Marple appeared. "Come to check I'm behaving myself, have you, Miss Marple?" he joked loudly, thumping the horse's flank. "Not going to find any spinsters hidden under the hay, I promise you." Miss Marple laughed politely, but her eyes missed nothing. Not the faint purple marks across Mr. Webb's knuckles, nor the fresh scuff on the toe of his heavy boot. "You knew Miss Carew well, I believe," she said, watching him over the rim of her spectacles. "Known her since we were both in pinafores," he said, a touch too heartily. "Fine woman. Bit stiff, maybe. Had her ways. Such as—" he shrugged, grabbing a pitchfork. "Fussy about rules. Never let a thing slide. If she thought you owed the church a shilling, she'd hound you like a terrier." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "And you, Mr. Webb, did you owe anything?" He paused, then chuckled. "Only good manners? No, ma'am, I'm square with the Lord and his accounts." Perhaps he was. Perhaps not. Miss Marple left him to his hay and his too careful cheerfulness, and continued along the lane. It was near the church, as she paused to catch her breath beside the lych gate, that she encountered Peter Denholm. The boy was trudging through the snow, his cap pulled low, his cheeks red with cold, and something more. Embarrassment or anxiety, perhaps. "Good morning, Peter," Miss Marple said warmly. "How is your mother?" Peter stopped, awkward and uncertain. She's all right, thank you, Miss Marple." "You must be very worried about poor Miss Carew," Miss Marple continued. "It's dreadful, not knowing." Peter flushed deeper. "I suppose so. I mean—" "Yes, of course." Miss Marple patted his arm kindly. "I imagine you're very busy with all this going on, helping at the shop and so on." He nodded hastily. "Yes, miss. Mum says every 10 counts these days." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed it does." She let him go then, watching him hurry away. A guilty boy, perhaps, but not necessarily a guilty man, and there was a difference. She knew, a very important difference. By the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, the first real news of the day had broken. Reverend Templeton, white-faced and shaking slightly, met her at the door. "You had better come in, Miss Marple," he said. "There's been a development." He led her to the small study, where Inspector Graves stood, grim and silent, beside the hearth. On the desk lay a small, crumpled scrap of cloth, a piece of white muslin, with a faint trace of crimson staining one edge. "We found it," Graves said shortly, "down by the old well behind the churchyard." Miss Marple bent to examine it, her heart beating a little faster. Not a child's handkerchief, not a scrap of an altar cloth, but a woman's handkerchief, lace-edged, fine, old-fashioned, Emily Carew's kind of handkerchief. Grave's mouth twisted. "There's blood on it, Miss Marple." Miss Marple nodded gravely. She straightened, her mind already fitting this new, dreadful piece into the larger puzzle. Emily Carew had not simply wandered away. Something violent had happened. And it had happened very near the heart of Alderley, under the cold stone gaze of St. Mildred's, and if violence had occurred once, it might not be the last time, especially if the guilty still walked free. Chapter 5. Tensions. Beneath the surface by noon, the discovery of the blood-stained handkerchief had spread through Alderley like wildfire. Mrs. Partridge, catching sight of Constable Pritchard carrying the small wrapped evidence from the churchyard, had practically sprinted to the greengrocer's to spread the word. Within an hour it was on everyone's lips. Emily Carew had not merely vanished, there had been violence. The village mood shifted palpably. The previous blend of fear and excitement had curdled into something darker. Suspicion, guarded glances, whispers that cut off abruptly when footsteps approached. It was under this heavy atmosphere that Miss Marple continued her work, a gentle, innocuous presence, welcomed wherever she wandered, her true observations carefully. Concealed beneath a web of polite conversation, at the Hare and Hounds, the only public house in Alderley, several men gathered that evening, nursing their ails and muttering into their mugs. Mr. Webb was there, his heavy bulk hunched over a corner table. Peter Denholm, conspicuously avoiding his gaze, lingered by the fireplace, pretending to read the notices tacked to the wall. Miss Marple, with Mrs. Templeton for company, passed by the open door just in time to hear a snatch of conversation. "Mark my words," Webb was saying, his voice thick. "If someone in this village did it, we'll soon know. Blood tells. It always does." There was a low murmur of assent. Peter shifted uneasily, glanced toward the door, then slunk out the side exit. Miss Marple tucked that observation away neatly in her mind. Mr. Webb, she thought, was pushing a little too hard, a little too loudly. It was always the over-eager ones who merited a second look. That afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Denholm under the pretext of delivering a skein of particularly fine embroidery wool. The Denholm cottage was clean but cramped. Mrs. Denholm, a stout, nervous woman, welcomed Miss Marple with flustered gratitude. "It's this. Business with poor Miss Carew," she said, wringing her hands. "It's unsettled us all. Peter, too. He's barely sleeping." "Such a strain," murmured Miss Marple sympathetically, "especially for a young man with responsibilities." Mrs. Denholm sighed. "He tries, bless him, works every hour he can, but the debts. My late husband left things in a poor state." "Debts?" Miss Marple echoed gently. "Yes, that can weigh heavily." She sipped her tea, casting her gaze about the neat but shabby room, the worn carpet, the mended curtains, the single good chair by the fire. Poverty left marks, she thought, and desperation could drive people to rash, even terrible acts. Still, there was something genuine about Mrs. Denholm's worry, something unfeigned. If Peter was involved, it was not with his mother's knowledge. Miss Marple rose soon after, leaving a few kind words and the skein of wool behind. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken once more, the snow glinting like powdered glass under the failing light. She pulled her coat tighter and set off for her final call of the day. Mrs. Blake received her at the door with a startled expression that quickly smoothed into polite welcome. "You find me in a muddle, Miss Marple," she said, leading the way into the front parlor. "This dreadful business has quite turned my brain. I can't seem to settle to anything." Miss Marple murmured condolences and settled herself primly on the edge of a stiff armchair. "Such a sad thing," she said, "and so unlike Miss Carew to attract any sort of violence." Mrs. Blake hesitated, fiddling with the edge of a cushion. She could be difficult, she said at last. Fussy, critical, always had an eye for how others conducted themselves. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Still, no one bore her any real ill will, surely. Mrs. Blake gave a tight little smile. I suppose not. Though, well, she had her enemies, if you could call them that. She wasn't forgiving. There it was. Again, the note Miss Marple had detected before. Not sorrow, not even shock. Resentment. Bitter, lingering resentment. "And you, my dear?" Miss Marple said softly. "You and Miss Carew, you got along?" Mrs. Blake flushed. "We managed," she said too quickly. Miss Marple sipped her tea and changed the subject to the difficulty of drying laundry in damp weather. Mrs. Blake relaxed visibly, chattering about hearth fires and damp sheets, but Miss Marple's mind was spinning. Quietly, she had seen enough in St. Mary Mead and beyond to know that resentments, especially among women accustomed to small, tightly governed lives, could fester into poison over time, especially when pride and appearances were at stake, especially when scandal, long buried, threatened to surface. By nightfall, the pieces in Miss Marple's mind had begun to arrange themselves into a preliminary pattern, still faint, still incomplete, but promising. She returned to the vicarage to find Reverend Templeton pacing the study, his hair disheveled, his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he burst out as she entered, "there's been an anonymous note." He thrust a crumpled piece of paper toward her. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The message was brief, written in a shaky hand. "The well. Look deeper. She's there. Inspector." Graves was summoned immediately. He examined the note, his mouth tight. "A crank," he said. "Some fool playing games." Miss Marple said nothing. She studied the note once more, her fingers tracing the uneven slant of the letters. Fear. The hand that wrote this had been trembling with fear, not mischief. She was sure of it. Inspector Graves, however, would not be dissuaded from his theory of village pranksters and idle cruelty. He ordered a few constables to search the old well behind the church more thoroughly the next morning, to satisfy the old ladies. As he muttered under his breath, Miss Marple, her face mild, said only, "Thank you, Inspector. It will put minds at ease." But inside she felt a growing certainty. Someone was desperate. Someone had thought the snow and silence would cover their crime. But the snow melted, and silence, Miss Marple knew, could be broken with a single, well-placed question. She sat by. The fire that evening, knitting quietly, her eyes distant. The guilty party had made a mistake already. Another, she thought, would come soon, and she would be ready. Chapter 6. Secrets by the Well morning brought a brittle, bright coldness to Alderley. The snow glittered under a pale sun, crusted hard overnight into sharp little ridges. From the vicarage window, Miss Marple watched as Inspector Graves led a small party of men toward the old well behind St. Mildred's. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and made her way carefully to join them, declining Mrs. Templeton's concerned offers of tea and toast. There was something in the air, a tautness, a readiness, that could not be ignored. The well itself was ancient, its low stone wall mottled with moss and lichen, a crooked wooden bucket still dangling from a rusted pulley. The constables had brought ropes and hooks, and the men set to work with a grim efficiency. Miss Marple stood quietly nearby, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. As the bucket was lowered down, the rope creaking eerily, minutes stretched long, then came a shout. "Something's here!" The villagers, who had hovered at a respectful distance, surged closer. Inspector Graves barked an order, and Constable Pritchard hurried to keep them back. Two men heaved together at the rope, grunting with effort. Slowly, something heavy emerged, a sodden bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Gasps broke from the watching crowd. Inspector Graves swore under his breath and moved forward, peeling back the layers carefully with gloved hands. Miss Marple, who had drawn closer in the commotion, watched with a grave, unreadable expression. It was not a body, as some had clearly feared. It was a bundle of belongings, a coat, a handbag different from the one found earlier, a pair of sturdy leather shoes, all soaked and stained from their long immersion. Among the items was something else, a small framed photograph, the image within still discernible despite the water damage. It was a photograph of Emily Carew, smiling stiffly in a neat garden. Inspector Graves straightened, face tight. "This," he said, "was no accident," the crowd murmured, uneasy and curious in equal measure. Miss Marple alone said nothing, but she noted, with her inward precision, the reactions of those around her. Peter Denholm, pale and wide-eyed, clutching his cap in both hands. Mrs. Blake, biting her lip, her eyes darting everywhere. But the bundle, Mr. Webb, a strange, grim satisfaction tightening his features. Secrets, Miss Marple thought. Everyone was carrying something, and secrets had a habit of rotting, just like the contents of that well. Later in the vestry, Inspector Graves laid out the recovered items, cataloging them with methodical care. Miss Marple sat primly nearby, ostensibly knitting, but her attention was keen and bright. There was nothing of immediate significance among the belongings. No bloodstains, no obvious signs of struggle, but Miss Marple knew better than to look only at the obvious. It was curious, deeply curious, that someone had gone to the trouble of disposing of Miss Carew's possessions separately from the woman herself. It suggested panic, yes, but also calculation, and calculation was a much colder thing. As Inspector Graves barked instructions to the constables, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. 2 bags, 2 locations, one to be found publicly, almost too easily, one hidden in a place meant never to be disturbed. She glanced once more at the photograph, the smile of the woman within its frame, oddly haunting. Emily Carew had enemies, yes, but perhaps she had also held secrets of her own. That afternoon, an informal gathering was called in the church hall, an effort, Reverend Templeton said, to keep spirits up and allow the community to share any information they might have. Miss Marple attended naturally and observed the proceedings with polite interest. Tea was poured and stale biscuits were passed about. The conversations were stiff at first, then loosened under the warm encouragement of Mrs. Templeton and the nervous energy of collective anxiety. Speculation ran rampant. "Could have been a stranger passing through," said Mr. Partridge, chewing reflectively on a currant bun. "Or one of those London evacuees. You never know about outsiders," added Mrs. Webb. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. It was when the conversation drifted back to the recovered belongings that something curious occurred. "I suppose," said Mrs. Blake, a little too loudly, "that the well was the perfect place to hide something if you were frightened. It's so old nobody ever goes there anymore." Mr. Webb grunted. "You seem to know a lot about it." Mrs. Blake flushed. "Everyone knows about the well. Bert Webb. It's hardly a secret." "Maybe not," Webb said darkly. "But not everyone's been seen poking about there before." Mrs. Blake paled. "I went once, years ago, blackberrying." There was an awkward silence. "Missy?" Marple's needles clicked softly. The only sound, Mrs. Blake's voice when she spoke again, was brittle. "You're all so ready to think the worst?" Miss Marple looked up mildly. "My dear Mrs. Blake," she said, "people in villages know each other's routine so well. It's only natural that anything unexpected stands out, especially now." Mrs. Blake's mouth tightened, but she said no more. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to flow away again. To the coming Candlemas service, to the threat of more snow, to the price of butter. But in her mind, she turned the exchange over carefully. Mrs. Blake had been defensive, too defensive. Miss Marple made a mental note to learn more about Mrs. Blake's movements on Candlemas Eve, and about her history with Emily Carew. There was more to that story. She was sure of it. Later, as the gathering dispersed and people drifted away into the falling twilight, Miss Marple lingered by the bulletin board in the church porch. There, amid notices about choir practice and charity drives, was a poster yellowed. With age well closed. Danger. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It had been posted years ago, but the words were still visible. Miss Marple tapped the tip of her cane lightly against the stone floor. Danger. The words seemed to echo in the still, cold air. Emily Carew had been a woman of habits, strict, moral, predictable, but if someone had threatened to expose a secret, or if she had stumbled upon something she ought not to have seen. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, almost sorrowful smile. There was always something. No one, not even a woman as precise and proper as Miss Carew, lived a life entirely free of entanglements. And entanglements, Miss Marple knew, could be deadly, especially in a village like Alderley, especially when Candlemas bells were about to ring. Chapter 7. The Cracks Beneath the Surface. The village of Alderley awoke the next morning beneath another heavy sky, the air thick with the promise of more snow. Yet even the threatening weather could not quell the restless murmurings that passed from door to door, hearth to hearth. Everyone was beginning to wonder, not if something dreadful had happened to Emily Carew, but who among them had made it. Happen! Suspicion curled like smoke through the narrow lanes, and Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in a thick gray shawl, made her way once more through the village, gathering scraps of conversation as deftly as a bird gathers twigs for its nest. The time for mere observation, she decided, was drawing to a close. It was time to gently press. Her first call of the day was upon Mrs. Webb, who lived in the smaller of the two farm cottages with her husband Bert. The place smelled sharply of boiled cabbage and damp wool, and Mrs. Webb, a small, sharp-eyed woman, greeted Miss Marple with visible wariness. "Forgive me for calling so early," Miss Marple said sweetly, "but I thought perhaps you might help me set my mind at ease about poor Miss Carew." Mrs. Webb's hands twisted in her apron. "Nothing I can tell you, Miss Marple. I hardly knew the woman." Miss Marple's blue eyes widened with innocent surprise. "But surely you sat with her at the harvest supper and again at the Candlemas preparations. I saw you speaking together myself." Mrs. Webb's mouth tightened. "A few words. That's all, about the flowers. She liked things done her way." "And I suppose," Miss Marple said gently, "that not everyone liked being told how things ought to be done." There was a tiny hesitation, a half-breath's pause, before Mrs. Webb said stiffly, "She meant well." Miss Marple smiled kindly and changed the subject to the difficulties of keeping poultry in freezing weather. But as she left, she tucked Mrs. Webb's discomfort neatly away in her mind. Not guilt, perhaps, but resentment. And resentment, Miss Marple knew, could be the seed of something much darker when properly watered. Her next stop was more deliberate. Peter Denholm had taken to spending his mornings at the back of the grocer's shop, stacking tins and pretending not to listen to the gossip swirling about him. Miss Marple found him rearranging a pyramid of tinned peaches with furious concentration. "Good morning, Peter," she said, laying a hand lightly on his arm. "Might you spare a moment to help an old lady carry her parcels home?" Peter flushed. "Of course, Miss Marple." Outside, laden with a modest basket, he walked beside her in awkward silence. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch just long enough before speaking. "It must be difficult," she said conversationally, "hearing people say such things about Miss Carew, about her disappearance, I mean." Peter scowled. "They don't know anything, none of them." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Gossip is so often wrong. It's easy to point fingers when one's frightened." Peter hesitated. I wouldn't—" He broke off, his face a vivid red. Miss Marple patted his hand. "I know, my dear boy. You mustn't trouble yourself so. I dare say Miss Carew would have been the first to forgive a youthful mistake, a missed payment, or a forgotten duty." Peter stopped walking. He stared at Miss Marple with something like astonishment. Then, after a moment, he said quietly, "She wasn't unkind, Miss Marple. She had expectations about what people ought to be." Miss Marple nodded, and "Sometimes," she said softly, "people fall short." Peter said nothing more, But Miss Marple, as they parted at her gate, felt that a small, important truth had been confirmed. Peter Denholm had been angry, perhaps ashamed, but not murderous. His guilt was the guilt of weakness, not wickedness. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a final call, this time to Mrs. Blake. She found the house strangely disordered, a basket of half-mended clothes abandoned in the sitting room, the tea tray still unwashed, a rug askew as if someone had tripped. Mrs. Blake herself answered the door with a strained smile. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting company." Miss Marple apologized prettily and stepped inside. "I won't stay long," she promised. "Only, it struck me, my dear, that you might be worried. About appearances." Mrs. Blake blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "People do talk," Miss Marple said, arranging herself neatly in an armchair. "So unfairly, sometimes. A widow living alone. Easy to make unkind assumptions." Mrs. Blake's face tightened. "I have nothing to hide." "Of course not," said Miss Marple soothingly. "But sometimes when people are frightened, they behave oddly. Hide things they ought to explain. Even things quite innocent. A quarrel, a misunderstanding." Mrs. Blake sat heavily in a nearby chair. For a moment she was very still. Then, without looking at Miss Marple, she said, "Emily Carew thought she knew best about everything, about the church, about the village, about people's private affairs." Miss Marple remained silent. "And when she found out," Mrs. Blake's voice cracked, "when she found out about my brother." Miss Marple's hands were very still on her lap. "Your brother?" she said quietly. Mrs. Blake pressed her hands together tightly. He had trouble with money. He borrowed, foolishly, secretly. Emily threatened to expose him, said it was her Christian duty. She said it would be for his own good." "And you were afraid?" Mrs. Blake nodded miserably. "Not for myself, for him. He's fragile, Miss Marple. It would have destroyed him." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "So you quarreled?" "Yes." "And after?" Mrs. Blake swallowed. "I don't know. I left her, there by the well. I didn't hurt her, I swear it. But when I heard she was missing, I thought—" "You thought people would blame you," Miss Marple finished softly. Mrs. Blake buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple rose and laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. "My dear, you must tell Inspector Graves, all of it. Secrets do more harm than truth ever could." Mrs. Blake nodded mutely. That evening, alone by the fire, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The cracks were showing now. People's alibis and defenses were beginning to crumble. She had coaxed out resentment, fear, anger, but she had not yet found the cold, hard thread of murder. Still, she was very close now. The guilty party, she knew, was already starting to falter. It would not be long before they made a mistake, and when they did, Miss Marple would be there to catch them, with all the quiet certainty of the village spinster who saw everything and forgot nothing. Outside the wind stirred, rattling the bare branches against the window. The Candlemas bells were waiting, and so was justice. Chapter 8. The final threads unravel me. The next morning a change had come over Alderley. It was not merely the weather, though a fresh dusting of snow softened the harshness of the village's outlines, but a change in atmosphere, a tightening of nerves, an invisible trembling just beneath the surface. Miss Marple noticed it as she moved through the village. A door that closed just a little too quickly, eyes that darted away a fraction too soon, conversations that stopped when she approached. The villagers were waiting for something to break. Miss Marple, however, was not waiting. She was ready. She began, as always, with something seemingly innocent. At the weekly mending circle at the vicarage, she allowed herself to drift into casual conversation with Mrs. Partridge, who prided herself on knowing every scrap of news worth knowing. "And to think," Mrs. Partridge was saying with relish, "all those years Miss Carew lived so quietly. You'd never think she had anything to hide, would you?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small frown. Hide Mrs. Partridge? I had always thought. Miss Carew was rather above reproach. Mrs. Partridge leaned forward, the hem of her apron trailing in her embroidery basket. "Well, you know, dear, it's always the ones who seem perfect you must watch." They say she had a letter, some terrible letter, threatening to expose someone, right before she disappeared. Miss Marple widened her eyes, the perfect picture of astonished innocence. Dear me. And however did you hear that? Mrs. Partridge beamed, gratified. Mr. Webb's nephew heard it from the inspector's constable. And you know how those young men talk after a pint or two. I see, said Miss Marple, thoughtfully. A letter. It made perfect sense. It would explain the peculiar urgency, the sudden tension she had felt in the village, even before Emily Carew vanished. A secret threatened with exposure could be a motive powerful enough to drive a good many people to desperate acts, but there was still a piece missing. She needed more, and she intended to get it. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a second visit. To the Hare and Hounds. This time she was not content to merely pass the open door. She entered, allowing herself to be shepherded into a corner by a solicitous Mrs. Graves, who saw in the elderly lady an opportunity to hear herself talk unchecked. I always said it, Mrs. Graves was saying, pouring generous measures of sherry into 2 small glasses. It wasn't safe, all these goings-on. Candlemas Eve or no Candlemas Eve, strange things happen when people think they're above God's law. Very true, murmured Miss Marple. Mrs. Graves lowered her voice confidentially. Mr. Webb's been in a state, you know, blustering and roaring like a bull, but scared underneath it. You can see it clear as day. Mr. Webb? Miss Marple repeated. Mildly, Mrs. Graves nodded vehemently. He owed her money. Had for years. Some business about a failed investment. Miss Carew kept it quiet out of kindness, but lately... She leaned even closer, her breath heavy with the scent of onions. Lately she was pressing him, said she needed the funds to repair the church windows. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. Serenely, how very interesting. It was, indeed, very interesting. Mr. Webb, with his loud indignation and ready bluster, had both motive and opportunity, but still she did not think he was clever enough for the subtlety of what had occurred. Violence, yes. Planning, no. The true culprit was clever, and growing desperate. As dusk fell, the vicarage saw another gathering. Inspector Graves, harried and flushed, had called a formal meeting of all those who had been involved in the Candlemas. Preparations, a desperate bid to shake loose some final clue. Miss Marple attended quietly, taking her place among the familiar faces. Peter Denholm, looking hunted. Mrs. Blake, pale but composed. Mr. Webb, glaring about him. Mrs. Webb, sitting stiffly at his side. And a scattering of others. Mrs. Partridge, Mrs. Graves, a few choir members. Reverend Templeton opened with a prayer, and then Inspector Graves stepped forward, his voice sharp and impatient. "We are no closer to finding Miss Carew," he said bluntly. "We must assume the worst. And someone here," he paused, letting his gaze sweep the room, "knows more than they are saying." There was a shiver through the assembled crowd. No one spoke. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands resting lightly on the handle of her umbrella. Inspector Graves went on, detailing the evidence, the 2 bundles of belongings, the blood-stained handkerchief, the anonymous note. When he mentioned the letter, the threatened exposure, a visible ripple went through the room. Mrs. Blake shifted in her seat. Peter Denholm dropped his eyes. Mr. Webb clenched his fists. But it was Mrs. Webb, meek, self-effacing Mrs. Webb, who gave the smallest, strangest reaction, a tiny gasp, quickly stifled. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, and in that moment she knew it was like the click of a lock opening. Mrs. Webb, not a player in the center of things, but a quiet, overlooked presence, the very sort of person who might, under enough pressure, do something unthinkable, to protect her husband, to save them both from ruin and disgrace. Miss Marple's mind raced backward. Mrs. Webb's defensiveness at the mending circle, her anxious glances at Bert Webb, the way she had minimized their connection to Miss Carew, and her visible terror now. Miss Marple rose quietly to her feet. "Inspector," she said in her soft, firm voice, "might I suggest a very simple test?" Inspector Graves blinked. "What sort of test, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled. "A demonstration merely. If you were to produce a copy of the letter Miss Carew was said to have written and read it aloud, even if the letter is but a fabrication, you might see something very enlightening in the room." Graves stared at her, then shrugged. "Nothing to lose, I suppose." He motioned to Constable Pritchard, who fetched a sheet of paper and began to read a fictitious letter describing Miss Carew's knowledge of debts and fraud, and her intention to bring them into the light. Miss Marple watched the room closely. Peter Denholm tensed but showed no fear. Mrs. Blake sat rigid, white-faced. Mr. Webb looked furious, but it was Mrs. Webb who crumpled. With a soft, broken sob, she slumped forward, her hands covering her face. "No more, Bert," she whispered. "No more lies. I can't." Silence fell. Miss Marple moved gently to her side. "There, there, my dear," she said. "Best to let it out." Mrs. Webb sobbed harder. "I didn't mean to. I only wanted to frighten her, to give her a scare so she'd leave Bert alone. But she slipped. She slipped." Her voice dissolved into incoherent weeping. Bert Webb lunged to his feet, cursing, but two constables restrained him. Inspector Graves, face grim, nodded sharply. "It's enough." Miss Marple stood back, her face very calm. Another tragedy, born not of hatred, but of fear. And fear, she thought sadly, was as deadly as any weapon. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, silent, inexorable. The Candlemas bells would soon ring, and the village, scarred but wiser, would move on, as villages always did. Chapter 9. The Candlemas. Bells ring. Again, it was a grim little party that returned to the vicarage that evening after Mrs. Webb's quiet confession had unraveled all remaining pretense. Inspector Graves, though vindicated, wore a heavy expression. Bert Webb had been taken into custody, protesting his innocence, but revealing, in his very bluster, how much he had known or guessed about his wife's desperate act. Mrs. Webb, sobbing in a low, pitiful voice, had been allowed to remain, temporarily under house arrest in her cottage, watched by a stern but not unkind constable. The village, still reeling from the shock, braced itself for the full tale to come out, as it inevitably would. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, Miss Marple sat quietly before the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Reverend Templeton hovered near the sideboard, offering tea and whiskey in equal measure. Mrs. Templeton, pale but composed, busied herself arranging a fresh tray of sandwiches no one wanted to touch. Inspector Graves leaned heavily against the mantelpiece, his brow furrowed. "Remarkable," he said, half to himself. "I'd never have thought it. Mrs. Webb. And yet, when you laid it out, Miss Marple, it was plain enough." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is often those we least suspect who act from the strongest motives," she said, "especially when fear is involved." Graves shook his head. "But to push her into the well?" Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "Not intentionally, Inspector. That much I do believe." Mrs. Webb went to the old well on Candlemas Eve to confront Miss Carew, to plead perhaps, or to threaten in a moment of weakness. There was a struggle, not necessarily a physical fight, but a flurry of fear and emotion. Miss Carew stumbled, lost her footing on the ice, and fell. She paused, her voice soft. Had they gone for help immediately, perhaps? But fear breeds foolishness. Mrs. Webb panicked. Rather than admit the accident, she, and later her husband, tried to conceal it. "And the belongings?" Inspector Graves frowned. "A clumsy attempt to muddy the trail," Miss Marple said, planting the first bag in the woods to suggest abduction, sinking the second in the well to hide the connection. Graves let out a low whistle. "You have the right of it, ma'am, as always." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. It was not difficult. Once you knew where to look. The next day the villagers gathered for the postponed Candlemas service. It was a subdued affair, the ancient rituals tinged now with a heavy sadness. The white candles gleamed against the dark wood of the church, and the choir's voices, though sweet, lacked their usual exuberance. Miss Marple sat quietly in her pew, her hands folded neatly before her. She watched as Peter Denholm knelt stiffly. Beside his mother, his young face set with something close to resolution. She watched Mrs. Blake, pale and composed, her hand resting on her brother's sleeve. She watched the empty seat where Emily Carew would have sat, her absence more eloquent than any sermon. As the Reverend intoned the ancient blessing, the bells began to ring. Clear, pure, and solemn, the sound drifted out across Alderley, over the thatched rooftops and the frozen fields. Miss Marple closed her eyes. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the mingling of grief and renewal. The stubborn resilience of life. The village would mend. It always did, but scars would remain. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room, sharing a quiet tea with Reverend and Mrs. Templeton. Outside, the snow fell softly, blanketing the lane in white. "You must stay a few more days, Miss Marple," Mrs. Templeton urged gently. "It's dreadful weather for traveling, and we so enjoy your company." Miss Marple smiled. "You are very kind, my dear. But I think I shall stay just one night longer, long enough to see the matter properly settled." Reverend Templeton cleared his throat. "If I may say so, Miss Marple, you have been an instrument of Providence in this village. Without you, we should still be groping blindly," Miss Marple demurred. "I have merely paid attention, Reverend. The truth is always there, if one listens carefully enough." There was a small pause. "Will Mrs. Webb be punished very severely, do you think?" Mrs. Templeton asked hesitantly. Miss Marple considered. "It will depend," she said carefully. "If the authorities believe her story, but that it was an accident followed by panic, they may show leniency. And in any case, I fancy the true punishment lies not in prison walls, but in the burden she must now carry." They were silent for a while, each lost in private thoughts. Miss Marple stirred her tea. "People are very much like plants, you know," she said. "Some grow straight and strong, no matter what storms assail them. Others, well, a hidden blight, a weakness unseen, and they collapse when the wind rises." Mrs. Templeton blinked back sudden tears. Outside, the bells rang again, their sound clean and untroubled. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she paused by the window to look out over the village. The rooftops gleamed silver under the moonlight. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked, a brief, reassuring sound. All seemed peaceful once more, and yet Miss Marple knew, beneath the calm surface, the old struggles continued. Pride, fear, envy, loneliness, the same frailties that had always existed, and always would. She smiled to herself, a little sadly, a little tenderly. Then she closed the curtains against the night and turned toward the warm, waiting bed. Tomorrow she would return to St. Mary Mead, her knitting, and her rose garden. But tonight, in Alderley, justice had been done, and the Candlemas bells had rung true. At last. A week later, the village of Alderley began, cautiously, to return to its usual rhythms. The candles from Candlemas were long extinguished, but a few brave snowdrops pushed their way up through the frosted soil around the churchyard, tiny white flags of peace and persistence. Life, as it always must, crept steadily forward. The hare and hounds buzzed with gossip once more, though now the talk had turned to spring fairs and lambing season. Mrs. Partridge resumed her brisk patrols through the village square, dispensing opinions and herbal remedies in equal measure. Even the Reverend Templeton, who had aged a little through the ordeal, found his sermons lightening once again with gentle humor. But there remained, beneath the village's busy surface, a faint thread of unease, the knowledge that such darkness had sprouted from so familiar a soil. The well had been sealed now. New stones, freshly mortared, hid the crumbling old mouth where tragedy had struck. No plaque marked it. No mention would be made at Sunday services. The village chose, as villages often do, to move forward by forgetting, or at least pretending to. As for Mrs. Webb, she had been quietly removed to her sister's home in Devon, pending formal charges. Sympathy for her ran high among the villagers, for hers had been a crime born of terror and despair, not cruelty. It was said she wept constantly, inconsolable, and that Bert Webb, stripped of his bluster, sat in the corner of his parlor staring at the fire, broken by the shame of it. Miss Marple, too, prepared to leave. Her small suitcase was packed and neatly fastened, her return ticket tucked into her handbag. Yet she lingered by the window of the vicarage guest room, looking out once more over the rooftops of Alderley, the thin wisp of chimney smoke, the slow wheel of crows overhead. It was a scene of such innocence, and yet she knew it contained all the raw materials of murder. How little we ever truly know of one another, she murmured to herself, even after years of living side by side. There was a tap at the door. It was Mrs. Templeton carrying a small parcel tied with twine. "From the ladies of the sewing circle," she said, smiling warmly. They insisted. Miss Marple accepted it with pleased surprise. Inside, she found a hand-stitched sampler, delicate and careful, bearing the words, "Blessed are the peacemakers." She smiled a little sadly. "I'm no peacemaker, my dear," she said, "only a humble observer." Mrs. Templeton laughed. "Perhaps, Miss Marple, but you observe things most of us never even see. And without you—" she shook her head. "Well, there would have been no peace to make." Miss Marple demurred gently, as was her habit. But inwardly she accepted the truth of it, observation, patience, an understanding of the small sins that flower into great ones. That was her craft and her curse. She left Alderley that afternoon, the village receding behind her as the train pulled away, the low whistle sounding across the fields. As she settled herself in the carriage, she allowed herself one last review of the events. It had not been malice that had driven Mrs. Webb, nor greed, nor hatred. It had been the most ordinary of things: fear of shame, fear of loss, fear of seeing everything she loved crumble into ruin, a small seed planted deep, and under pressure grown into tragedy. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Blake, burdened by her brother's mistakes, of young Peter Denholm, weighed down by pride and humiliation, of Mrs. Partridge and Mrs. Graves, gossiping as a means of staving off their own small fears. Alderley was no different from St. Mary Mead, nor, indeed, from London or Paris, or anywhere men and women lived together under the bright, brittle shell of society. Human nature, frail, foolish, stubborn, was the same everywhere, and understanding that, Miss Marple thought, was the only true protection against its tragedies. She looked out the window as the countryside blurred past, fields giving way to woods, woods to towns. In a few hours she would be home. Her cottage would be waiting, the kettle ready to boil, the knitting basket by her favorite chair. There would be letters to answer. The garden would need tending. New scandals to hear at the Women's Institute, small, delicious scandals about misplaced cakes and rivalry over rose-growing competitions. Ordinary life, and yet behind it, always, the knowledge that evil could spring from the most unlikely quarters. Miss Marple smiled, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and allowed herself to doze as the train rocked gently onward. Behind her, Alderley would heal. Ahead of her, new puzzles waited, and Miss Marple, quite gentle Miss Marple, would be ready as always.